Where do launches come from? We're going to talk about the manifest and launch process, both from a CSLI or CubeSat Launch Initiative process, as well as a UNP process. So what we're going to talk about today. So number one, we're going to talk about the launch manifest process. We're going to talk about between manifest and delivery, what's going to be going with your spacecraft, detailing some delivery and launch. Some really good ideas about how to design some manifesting and launching so that you can actually have an optimum or wide breadth and range of launch opportunities for your spacecraft. And then we're also going to talk about the CSLI approach as well as the UNP approach to both manifesting and launching. They're both very similar, but they're also different in very special ways. So we'll just talk about that as well. So launch manifest, right? So the idea of where do launches actually come from, right? And so you got a couple options. Let's say that you were out there, you built your spacecraft's ready to go, and you're ready now to go find a launch. You have pretty much three main options, right? If you have really deep pockets, you could buy your own launch vehicle, right? That costs you upwards of $50 million of rockets. The benefit to that is that, you get to control the schedule, you have complete control of the vehicle, you get to write your own requirements, you get to get mission unique requirements. Say, like, for instance, you need a nitrogen purge and you're really sensitive to helium. You can make sure and mandate the spacecraft not put you in a helium-rich environment. And also make sure, of course, then that, that you're not going to have to worry about any humidity over your specific requirements. The cons, of course, is unless you're a government mission, or, a corporation with extremely deep pockets, you don't really have that much money to go around, right? So then the other options are you could buy your own rideshare slot. And this is where you see a lot of people actually going nowadays. And the good thing about that is that a good rideshare slot is about $300,000. The price is cheaper. However, it comes from some pretty big caveats, right? This is almost akin to you buying a ticket to go to the bus and the bus is taking you to Disney World. You're at the mercy of the launch vehicle provider schedule. They're telling you when you need to have deliverables be deliverable to them so you can make their requirements. You have very little opportunity for pushback on launch vehicle requirements. So say, for instance, you had a really specific requirement that you needed met. If you're buying your own rideshare slot on a traditional rideshare mission, you're going to have very little ability to actually negotiate that. Matter of fact, if you try to negotiate that, they're going to tell you to pound sand or just go find another launch vehicle, and you're kind of stuck. If you need licensing assistance with the FCC, or with NOAA, you're not really going to be able to give them that. You're going to have to figure all that stuff out on your own. You will have a launch vehicle agreement with them where they're going to tell you what they're going to provide for you in terms of requirements, but you're going to have very little insight into their processes, why the requirements are the way they are. You're not really going to have any mission-specific requirements, and oftentimes they're going to be taking you to one specific spot in space. So if you can live with, say, 550 kilometers at SunSync, with a specific LTAN, and that was good for your science, that's perfect. But if you need something a little more exotic in your orbit, then that's not for you. The other option here is why you guys are all here, is we are talking about actually applying to a program like the CubeSat Launch Initiative or the University Nanosatellite Program, and that takes care of the launch opportunity for you. Now, we cover the launch and integration costs up to a point, right? We cover the first $300,000 for CSLI. And you're actually able to draft your own requirements. You get licensing assistance, you get a signed ICD. So basically meaning that that's an interface control document, meaning that if you see something or that the launch vehicle is trying to impose a requirement on you that will not meet your requirements in terms of the interface, you can push back on that and say, we're not going to go on this, we're not going to accept that requirement. And there's actually a payment milestone attached to that, so they won't get paid unless you guys come to a happy medium. And then you also get more insight into verification and launch vehicle processes. The con of this, because our budgets are flat, and we have, to be honest, about 80 CubeSat missions that are currently in the initiative, you forfeit the ability to say what launch vehicle you want to go on. We see a really good deal that meets your requirements on, say, Rockets Are Us. There's a chance that you could go on that launch, right? And you need to be ready for that launch opportunity. However, you still are able to not have to pay for the launch, which is a good thing, get your specific requirements, and you actually get the licensing assistance as needed. The good thing, too, about University CubeSat is that you guys most likely are going to be rideshare missions, right? You most likely are going to definitely go through a third party. And like I said before, you're going to have to probably accept what is offered. But it's not like I said that we're going to just put you on a rocket that does not meet your requirements or force you into if you're a square box, we're not going to push you into a round hole kind of thing. We're going to make sure the launch vehicle requirements actually meet your requirements and that the launch vehicle actually meets your needs. However, you do need to be ready when you're going to have to launch, obviously. All right, launch manifest offers for University CubeSat. So this is why you guys are all here, right? You guys are working on system design concepts so that you guys can be ready to apply to one of these programs, right? And so you're going to really want to apply to a program, either UNP or CSLI, that provides these launches, right? When you're actually looking at your range in your orbital parameters, you're going to want to really carefully determine orbital ranges that work and those that don't. However, you need to also ensure that you aren't so limiting yourself that you'll never be able to fly. So you want to provide acceptable ranges, but then you also want to say, if I had my druthers, or if I really could actually have control of my own destiny, this is the exact orbit that I would want. But you want to be flexible with that. Because when you get really specific orbit parameters can drive up the cost of your launch service, and it can make it really difficult for you to find your launch vehicle that can actually meet your requirements. So once you actually are prepared to apply for one of these programs, you're accepted. Make sure that when we ask for paperwork, either questionnaires, you should submit all that paperwork promptly. Ask questions if you're filling out a safety data template you don't understand or you don't understand the testing. When you're looking at your schedule, we always say that your schedule is neither aspirational nor inspirational. It should be a realistic schedule with adequate margin that you actually can meet, because there are consequences if you cannot make your launch date, right? Consequences that we will get into a little bit later. And a lot of times delays, they're not due to your fault, right? Sometimes there's supply chain issues. Sometimes there's a part that actually breaks during testing. So we recognize that, but we want to definitely make sure that when you sign up for a launch date, that you have adequate margin in your schedule, that your schedule actually reflects reality, and that it's not sporty or anything like that, but you actually can make it. Recognize too that, when you say that you're going to deliver documentation to support these launches, that if you're shifting dates and you're going back and forth, and that it just adds confusion and it adds difficulty to your launch service and can cause problems with your integrator. So behind the scenes, so most launch vehicles, believe it or not, when they're launching on a primary mission, they actually do have excess performance. And in NASA, we actually write the contract such that when a mission launches, we actually own that excess performance. So then we're actually then able to scour and look around and say, okay, we have, about 300 kilograms of excess performance in this launch vehicle. What CubeSats or what small sats do we actually have that can make the schedule and can meet this launch availability, right? And so that's one way that we look at this. Some missions are actually dedicated ride shares, where we buy a rocket and we actually are then populating that rocket with all rideshare missions. So it's not like one mission actually owns that rocket. That mission is actually the launch vehicle costs are actually separated or divvied up between all the rideshare missions that are actually on there. Those are called dedicated rideshare missions. Now, most U.S. programs, NASA and DoD, due to regulatory reasons, we have to exclusively use U.S. launch vehicles, basically due to ITAR and the Commercial Space Launch Act, basically saying that we have to buy U.S.-based launch vehicles. And you may ask yourself the question, so how are you guys launching on an Electron? Isn't Rocket Lab out of New Zealand? That's true. Rocket Lab has actually formulated themselves in such a way that they actually are a U.S.-based company, so that's why we're actually able to use them. And there are instances in the past, too, where we actually are able to launch on foreign-made launch vehicles, speaking from the NASA perspective. However, those are special circumstances. In terms of agreements that have to be signed, there's a long process. And typically, given the budgetary constraints and typically the time constraints that we're going to have for your missions, a lot of times those missions are not the best fit for CubeSat missions, so we kind of just don't even look at those options. Now, all government programs, as you see there next chart, we do have access to everyone else's slides. So CSLI is in regular communication with the DoD, the Space Test Program, and the Multi-Manifest Office there to actually talk to them to see what slots they have upcoming on their missions. And we actually offer them rides, and they offer us rides. And then UNP also has access to NASA slots as well, launching on the ISS. And so if you actually are offered a slot, don't turn it down or don't snub your nose at it if it's not perfect for you. Frankly, to be honest, if you do snub it down, we will, in CSLI, will ask you, what requirement doesn't this meet? Because as I said, we will actually, if it meets your schedule, it meets your requirements from our perspective, given our limited budget, we have to make sure that our budget is stretched as far as possible to offer as many launch slots to all of our spacecraft that are on contract with us. The only reason you probably should not accept is if the timeline is not realistic. It's better to say at the very beginning of a slot that's offered to you if you can't make it, rather than trying to make up ground, trying to make up development time. Because in all honesty, there are severe repercussions on us if we can't make those launch dates in terms of monetary costs, loss of faith, with launch vehicle providers and so forth and so on. So if you're offered a slot, think long and hard about whether or not the timeline is realistic and whether or not it meets your requirements, and then be prepared to defend why you're not able to actually make that launch slot if you can't make it. Once you've accepted the launch slot, CSLI and UNP will begin meeting with the integrator. Now, CSLI is, we actually, in all of our meetings, encourage for educational purposes for you, the spacecraft developer, to meet with the integrator with us on the line, obviously, to talk over their schedule, talk over their requirements, to ensure that, A, that they're getting it straight from the horse's mouth, what you all need, and to make sure they're meeting your requirements. And then also, too, so this actually can be a learning experience for you all to work with the integrator. So most of the time, the launch vehicle provider may manage their own CubeSat integration, but in most cases that I've seen, they actually do will pass it off to a third-party integrator, such as your Spaceflight, your Mars, your Maverick, your Parsons, your Tyvak or Sharon Orbital, your Exenti, those kind of folks, right? And in CSLI, we actually make sure that we hold regular meetings with all of our satellite teams on a 2-week basis, right? This is to make sure that we're all moving ahead, that all the information is being shared. And CSLI and UNP will actually attend those missions on behalf of you as well. And we're actually there to kind of step in if they're talking and guide you all with technical assistance, technical know-how. So when something's asked of you in these meetings, make sure you provide the deliverables as promptly as requested, because if they're asking you for input, it's because possibly they're needing that information to clear something with the range or clear something with their own safety process. So any delay and any deliverables that is being asked of you that are not delivered to them directly impacts their launch schedule and impacts your ability to make that launch. The meeting can cover a whole host of topics, right? It could cover your spacecraft design, your build, it can cover your environmental test expectations, your launch integration schedule, the spacecraft, what you guys need from the launch vehicle, although this very rarely applies to CubeSats. It really can just run the gamut of what the meeting topics can actually cover. A lot of times we're coordinating inputs to make sure that the spacecraft, the launch vehicle rather, has what they need to go talk to the range, to the FAA, to get their licensing, to make sure that their safety templates are put together, to make sure your battery testing is up to date. So a lot of times these meetings they can be mentor meetings, but they also could be working meetings so that everyone has what they need to make sure that everyone is doing what they need to do to ensure that you're making your launch schedule on time and on schedule. All right, so delivery. You've completed all your launch vehicles, you completed your spacecraft, you're at the point now, you turned in all your data, you turned in all the templates that are needed, you're ready to deliver, right? So the university will actually deliver the satellite to actually the integrator. The integrator for CSLI actually handles the delivery. CSLI will actually work with you to identify environmental testing options, showing you, okay, so this is where we've heard people can test that. These are what we've used. These are people you can contact with to actually help you get that. The required testing actually completed. The delivery actually can occur either at the integrator's facility or actually the launch site. A lot of times what happens is that the integrator will actually have you deliver the spacecraft to their facility, so then they can, deliver it to the dispenser and then deliver that dispenser then over to the launch vehicle there for integration. Very rarely is the CubeSat team actually allowed to be directly involved in launch vehicle integration. There are some cases where it's happened, but very rare. And very rarely will the CubeSat team actually deliver directly to the launch site. You can actually travel to the launch site on your own dime. However, this is very, very rare. And quite frankly, a lot of times the launch vehicles, they don't really like it per se because they have some processes that they're trying to keep proprietary. And also, too, there's just a safety thing as well, right? Typically, if you're for delivery, you're planning to really deliver between 45 to 90 days prior to launch. For CSLI and UNP, we really would want to have your environmental testing wrapped up at least 3 months, hopefully prior to actual delivery. Although, to be honest, a lot of times for CSLI, we finish up their environmental testing of between 45 days to 60 days prior to launch or prior to handover. So once everything's worked out, all the launch vehicle provider, everything's ready to integrate, the integration meetings have all been worked out. Through all those integration meetings, we're going to work out when the handover is going to be, what equipment is actually going to be needed to facilitate the integration and delivery onto the launch vehicle, what is going to be required of you, where you're going to need to show up, and that sort. And those are also things that are going to be handled in those meetings with the launch vehicle provider or with the integrator. So design consideration. Taking a step back, we've already talked about the process of how you're going to meet with the integrator, how you're going to actually design your spacecraft. How would I, if I'm looking at from your perspective now, what are some pitfalls to actually avoid to make sure that I have the maximum amount or maybe able to optimize my manifesting option? One thing I will say is you really do want to be flexible with your orbital parameters. And one way to do this is to be compatible with as many dispensers as possible. Look at the CubeSat design spec that is called out on CubeSat.org. Read that spec. Make sure your CubeSat is actually compatible with that spec. And where you're not compatible, call out possible exceptions where you are not compatible. Don't design to a specific dispenser, because when you do that, there's a good chance, at least for CSLI, that you're not going to get that dispenser, and there may be some issues there, ensuring that you have the maximum range of manifesting opportunities that are actually afforded to your mission. And then also, too, a pet peeve, please, please, please avoid tab designs. I can only speak for myself. Tabs are a pain in the rear end to deal with. A lot of times, the dispensers that to actually be compatible with tabs are very limited. And so you get into a case that it makes it very difficult for the launch vehicle provider at times to procure a dispenser for you. Not only that, a lot of times tab dispensers actually drive up the cost of your launch service. Because of their design, they actually clamp down your spacecraft to the point that you create a coupled system. And so essentially now, if your spacecraft originally had some frequencies above, say, 150 hertz, now your frequencies are now in the 40 to 50 hertz range, which means that you are coupling with the launch vehicle, which is always really bad. So you may actually need isolators so you actually could survive the launch environment, which is actually pretty bad because that drives up the cost of your launch service and drives up the integration cost. So in general, tabs are not my favorite thing to work with. Also, too, there's a spec out there called LC Rec 317.01. This spec is not a hard and fast spec that you should follow, but it's a good idea, because if you actually comply with all of the requirements in that spec in terms of pressure vessels, propulsion, space situational awareness, thermal testing, vibration environment, you can fly almost on any launch vehicle that's out there, because that spec was designed to fly with Class A or even flagship missions. Basically saying that if I put your CubeSat on those same launch vehicles as the James Webb Space Telescope, you're not going to cause any harm to the James Webb Space Telescope. So as you can imagine, the requirements in that document are pretty strict and pretty rigorous. So if you comply with that, you pretty much have been able to be manifested almost on anything. I've already touched on this one too, but the next one is be flexible with orbit requirements. Don't have an overly specific orbit. A lot of our launch vehicles, if they're going to a specific orbit and you want to go someplace else, you're going to be sitting on the ground for quite a while before we can find you an orbit for that, to be frank. There's the old adage, if the bus is going to Pittsburgh, it can't take you to Cleveland. There's no just way physically that's possible. Unique orbits drive up launch costs, right? And they reduce launch opportunities. There's no other way about it. Also, to avoid overly congested orbits. If you guys are aware, there's a certain provider that's going to a 550 sunsync quite frequently, right? I would pretty much advise that you probably may not want to go there, just for the simple fact that you're going to have to do a lot of coordination with NASA as well as with that corporation, SpaceX, to ensure that you have your space situation awareness and your space traffic management issues worked out so that you don't accidentally collide with the Starlink spacecraft and cause problems up there for everybody. So in general, look at the overly congested orbits, 550, Sunsync, Kuiper is going to be coming online shortly. That's another one to think about. So think about those congested orbits, where they are, where they're going, and try not to go there. Let's just say that. Design for demise. So what you want to do is when you re-enter into the Earth's atmosphere, you do not want to have large pieces of high melting point materials. That's going to complicate, that's for a couple of reasons. It's going to complicate you getting licenses from the FCC or from your licensing authority, and it may cause you to do costly redesigns. If you're unsure what the high melting point temperature, we're talking glasses, your glass, ceramics, a lot of titanium, metals such as that, you want to avoid those. If you're unsure about the amount that you have in there, just ask. And we can have one of our analysts actually run the numbers to see what it is and see if you actually meet the threshold. You'll be surprised how often naming conventions mess us up with our manifesting opportunities. Choose a unique name for your CubeSat and be consistent. I say be consistent because you may name yourself NormanSat1 in one document, and then the next document you put in is Norman-Sat-1. Okay, that's not consistent. We go through different organizations with those different names, there's going to be confusion. And at the end of the day, if everything doesn't match up, the FCC or one of your licensing authorities or even the ISS safety panel, they're going to get confused. They're not going to know how to handle your spacecraft, and that just causes problems later down the road. Avoid names, too, that have a single common word, chart, press, hello, 5. Avoid special characters. I know it's really cute to have the XXO or the hyphens or the dollar signs or whatever in your names, but avoid those. Those things actually make licensing very, very difficult. If you're planning on going to the International Space Station, plan accordingly. The battery testing for the ISS is unique. The number of inhibits that you need to design for in your CubeSat can vary based on the fact whether or not you have propulsion or not, whether or not they deem it a Class 1 safety hazard or higher. And so the number of inhibits that you're going to have there are going to be different. So plan accordingly and talk to LSP early about those things. And then also, you guys are students. You're going to graduate. You're going to have internships. Plan ahead. Eventually, you're going to move on. Plan for your project to live on without you so that knowledge can actually be transferred and shared. You would not be surprised how many times we have members graduate and they forgot to share the password with them on a certain document, and a team is shut down for a while until they can get that information. Also, so you'd be surprised too how much time teams actually use because someone that they were working with graduated or moved on and they had all the knowledge, and you're trying to bring other people up to speed, and that just limits your ability to be ready for a launch opportunity. Plan for skill, knowledge, and skill transfer. All right, avoid hazardous materials. UNP requirements exist to help you avoid those, right? CSLI, we're a little bit more, I don't want to say lax, but we are a little bit more understanding. If your science actually dictates that you have something that you need to fly or there's provocative features that you need to fly, we point that out in our selection process, and then we try to work with you there to ensure that we can get you actually flown. In the instance there, just avoid those hazardous materials and systems whenever possible. If you have a question about something you're flying, let us know, and we can actually work with you on that. If your spacecraft can actually alter its orbit, right, make sure you actually are thinking about space situational awareness. Use GPS, right? Know where you're going to be when you're going to be there. There is actually a NASA standard there to actually make sure that if you can't actually alter your orbit, that you need to actually be able to share your ephemeris data with other spacecraft and other owner-operators. This is to make sure that there are no conjunctions, make sure you don't run into each other, and that we don't have a bad day in space. Also, too, consider cybersecurity so a bad actor can't take over your spacecraft and then turn it into a guided missile into something that's already up there. That would be very, very bad, and we don't want to avoid that. And also, too, don't plan on jettisoning any pieces or parts on orbit or breaking off any smaller pieces without clearly thinking about how to track. Typically in CSLI, we will not select your spacecraft if you're planning on breaking up into pieces that are larger than 1U because it's just trackable. However, you are able to tether your spacecraft. And if you can make a convincing argument that you're going to be trackable and that your radar cross-section is going to be such that we actually can track you from the ground, that's something that we will consider. But in general, let's try to stay away from that. Passivation, right? So at the end of your mission, you're going to need to figure out a way to be able to deplete your batteries and make sure there's no stored energy, be able to disconnect your solar panels and vent any stored pressure. This is basically to ensure that your spacecraft won't accidentally explode, or that if you are hit with a piece of space debris in orbit at the end of your mission, that you won't be, let's just say, kinetic, and something will blow up and they'll actually create smaller pieces of your spacecraft. This is actually something that when you go through the FCC licensing process, and as you go through our ODAR process, we're going to ask you these questions to see if you actually can passivate your spacecraft. Typically in the past, we were able to get an exemption of spacecraft that were 6U and smaller, but going below 540 kilometers. However, that standard has been tenuous at best lately. So now we're just telling people to think about how can you deplete your batteries, how can you disconnect your solar panels, and so forth and so on. The last two here, think through your licensing plan, think through your RF plan, think about also too what like the licenses you're going to have. If you're going to be using amateur frequency bands, how are you going to coordinate with the IARU? If you're going to use one of those amateur frequency bands, think about how you're going to actually have a benefit to the amateur frequency community. They're actually really looking for that. So think about those things. Think about your frequencies, your flexibility in ground station. Practice tracking, setting up your ground station beforehand and tracking satellites that are actually overhead with your ground station. You actually can do that. So practice doing that as well. And then also too, last but not least, think through any sensitivities you may have to things such as helium, humidity, hydrocarbons, magnetic fields, and think about whether or not what you can live with. Because when we start adding helium sensitivity, really strict humidity requirements, magnetic field requirements, those can qualify as mission unique requirements that you may be able to get if you get your launch vehicle, but it could drive up the cost of your launch service. Or if you design something that's so tight that it may actually limit your ability to actually find a launch unless you're able to live with something less than perfect. All right, so now we've kind of gone through all of those. We're talking about the CSLI manifesting approach, right? So the submission process here is that NASA is going to release our partnership opportunity every year, the first week of August, typically at SmallSat. You guys are then responsible for securing your funding, submitting proposals in response. The proposals are always due in November of every year, typically the week before Thanksgiving, so just be prepared for that. The selection process then, once we get all the proposals in there, this is the CSLI board then reviews all the proposals. We score them based on the alignment with our strategic goals and objectives. And then the selection committee then prioritizes those missions that were actually submitted that year, and then NASA actually announces the selectees. The way it works also too is that missions that were selected prior to yours, they actually get more priority than your mission, right? However, if you scored really highly due to the selection process, you're actually going to be higher on that priority than missions that were actually selected in the same year as you. Now, someone may ask the question, what if I'm ready to go before one of those other missions? Well, then if that's the case, then there is a possibility that you actually could jump the line and actually be manifested before those other missions that have higher priority than you, if you are ready. So then once you actually are selected, we actually then give you something called a CRADA to sign. It's called the Cooperative Research and Development Agreement. You sign that agreement basically telling us that NASA is now able to procure you a launch service. But make sure you actually read that document pretty closely, because what it also says is that NASA CSLI is responsible for finding you a launch service and providing integration costs and, providing that launch service up to $300,000. But then if you don't show up for that launch service, you owe NASA all the money that we've spent to actually procure you a launch service. Because if you don't show up and we've spent money to get you a launch service, then that's money that we can't spend to put them on a launch service. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Based on that committee readiness, after we get all those CRADAs signed, we then identify missions that are ready for manifesting. And then when your readiness date comes up, pretty much almost a year prior to you ready to launch, we hold what's called a pre-preparedness readiness review to determine your readiness and ensure that we actually are ready to go out. To ensure that, yeah, your readiness date was purported as such and such, but we want to really take one more final look under the hood to make sure that you are ready for us to go out and buy you a launch service. All right, so now if you pass the PPRR, the pre-prepared readiness review, we then work with you to draft what we call a launch services interface requirements document. Once that document then captures actually all your requirements, all of the missions of your spacecraft, we then go out to a launch service bid among all the eligible launch service providers. The mission is awarded, everyone's happy, integration telecoms begin. The pre-award there assumes then that the government rideshare opportunity is not actually available. When I say government rideshare, as you remember earlier that we actually share rockets with other government agencies. So there's a good chance then that you may not even go through a bidding process if we identify after you pass the PPRR that you are a better fit for DoD rideshare mission and that actually meets your requirements. So you may not go out for bid, but you still, in the rules the same, you're still going to get a launch vehicle. All right, so I think I've kind of already talked through most of this here. The one thing here is just to hit it once again, a PPRR is just there to make sure that you are ready for launch, that you have the technical ability and the know-how to show up and be ready for integration. Have a launch service readiness less than 24 months. You got to have submitted that questionnaire document that I referred to. And then you also have to assign that CRADA document. Who we want to actually attend these meetings, we want of course, the mission managers from CSLI. We also want our project and technical leads from your CubeSat team. And we really want these meetings to be student-run and student-led. So we really want you guys, the students, to lead these missions. And then we also want your faculty advisors there too, to actually be there as well. All right, so these are the components of a pre-preparedness readiness review, things that you should have available already. Number one, we need to know your mission overview, your CONOPS, what's the mission you're trying to achieve, the CRADA, make sure you've read the CRADA, that it's been signed. Tell us your orbital insertion requirements. Why do you even want to launch? Why do you want to go to that specific place in orbit? Identify all the constraints and preferences for why you need that orbit. You may get some pushback there because in general, we're trying to make sure that you're not limiting yourself to one specific orbit that no one can meet. If you want to go to 300 kilometers equatorial, then you may be sitting on the ground for a while. So we want to make sure that if you are really asking for that, what's your justification and if we can open up that orbital parameters quite a bit. We're going to look at the CubeSat spec compliance. Like I said before, the CubeSat design spec, CDS 14.1 on CubeSat.org, right? We want to make sure that you look at that spec, that you're able to identify what version that you designed to, and then point out any non-compliances, because we want to make sure that if we say you are compliant with that spec, that we are able to point out the non-compliances to the launch vehicle provider so that then they can provide a dispenser that meets all your requirements. We want to make sure that you have images of your spacecraft. Why? Because if you have images of your spacecraft, either a flat sat or either CAD images, you're a little further along than most people. You'd be surprised how many times in the past people said they were ready for integration or ready for a launch service procurement and they didn't have a flat sat, or they were unable to show the stowed or operational state of their spacecraft or even dimensional or orthogonal views of their spacecraft. So this is another just a check we do. We want to look at your communications architecture, look at your transmitters, your receivers, your frequencies you're requesting for, identifying any amateur frequency bands. Also, too, this is where we look at your licensing, whether or not you're going to need an FCC licensing consultant, which CSLI was happily provide you for, so you can actually get licensing help where you need it. We're going to look at your safety and orbital debris, if you have the propulsion, if you have high voltage systems, if you have systems with stored energy, whether or not you have looked at the passivation requirements on your power source. We're going to look at those things. We're going to look at whether or not you are holding any hazardous materials, whether or not you are compliant with the ASPACE document or the emission range and safety documentation. Have you thought through these things? We're going to look at your sensitivities, right? We're going to look at whether or not you're sensitive to helium, humidity requirements, hydrocarbon levels. Is there a cleanliness level that you need for your clean room when you're actually integrating? And then lastly, we're going to look at your project schedule and budget. Do you have a critical path identified? Do you have all your components in-house? Is your budget safe? Do you have adequate margin with your budget? Are you going to need to hold more bake sales to actually finish your spacecraft? Technically, you aren't even allowed to be selected in CSLI without your budget situation being closed, but we do realize that sometimes budget overruns do occur due to price scarcity. So we want to make sure we look at that prior to actually putting you on contract. So those are kind of the components that we're looking at. And if you can see here, this is not supposed to be an onerous task here for us to look at, but it's just for us to get a good warm and fuzzy of where you're at to see if you're ready for the procurement. The launch triangles, where are our launches coming from, right? Just really quickly there. So we have the International Space Station launches. If you really want to really maximize your launch availability, design to the ISS. We have missions that go up there, either on CRS missions or crew missions, at least every quarter. And so there's a good chance if you're ready for one of those opportunities, you will be able to launch a little sooner rather than later. And then also, too, there's a good chance if you are designing to the ISS that your mission is still going to fall under that $300,000 requirement that we actually can cover your launch integration costs. And then the other one we kind of use, we have this contract structure called VADR, right? It's the Venture Acquisition Dedicated Rideshare Launches, right? And what this is that we actually will take your requirements, we'll develop the Launch Services Integration Requirements document, and then we'll put it out for bid. And the good thing about capitalism is that once you find that other people are competing against each other, the prices tend to go down for these launch services. And so then what we'll do is we'll get those proposals back, we'll evaluate them for schedule, cost, and performance from all the different launch vehicle providers, and then we'll actually integrate you there for those launch services. So then also to the other way we did it, I talked about this before, was government rideshare opportunities, right? So we look at the DoD, their launches that they're offering, and we'll see if there's some excess capability there that we actually can then use to actually launch your CubeSats. However, we still need a launch services integration requirements document for all of these because we want to make sure that if there are requirements or exotic materials or anything like that that are called out, that we are aware of those, especially for station, right? Because there are since there's people there in the loop, we want to make sure that we're being safe, that we're doing everything in decently in order there as well. All right, so post-launch vehicle award process, right? So you've been awarded, you're on a launch vehicle, you're about ready to hand over, right? There's some things you have to do, right? So you got to test, first of all, and make sure that you are compliant with all the launch vehicle range orbital debris requirements. Now remember here, if you're going on a launch vehicle outside the ISS, you're going to have to basically show compliance with all the launch vehicle requirements. So they have a dynamic environment or assigned environment that you need to meet, or a random environment that, say, GES 14.1 GRMS, you're going to have to be compliant with that, and you're going to have to show that, right? If you're compliant with all range and orbital debris, the testing documentation is going to be reviewed both by CSLI and the launch vehicle, right? Then your CubeSat, say you meet all that, all your documentation looks good, then you're going to be integrated into the dispenser. We already touched on that. That's either be delivered at the launch vehicle processing site or shipped directly to the launch vehicle. The dispenser is now integrated into the launch vehicle. You're good to go, right? Your mission launches, right? CSLI will pay for the launch up to $300,000 to cover your integration costs, but we unfortunately won't pay for you to attend. So if you plan to attend, definitely do so. Launches are cool. We see them all the time down here in Florida. Everyone should see a launch, but plan to attend on your own dime, right? So then after a specified time after launch, your CubeSat's deployed. Now, depending on your requirements, certain launch vehicle providers actually mandate that you have to be deployed and turn on your spacecraft a certain time period after deployment, right? If there's a need for you to actually be deployed, say within 10 minutes or so after deployment, that's a requirement you want to call out, something that we make sure that they are compliant with in the LSIRD. You're deployed, you are then provided state vectors provided by the launch vehicle. You make contact with your spacecraft. You complete, 6 months to 2 years later, you complete your mission, you burn up upon reentry. And then the thing about CSLI then is the only thing we ask of you after you complete your mission, we ask that once you look at your data, you write your technical paper, and then you provide those results to NASA. So then we can share those results and we can share your mission with the greater community. I've talked a little bit about the Launch Services Program, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. So technically, CSLI is an initiative that is managed by the Launch Services Program down here at Kennedy Space Center, right? We manage all of NASA's uncrewed missions, be it from CubeSats all the way up to your flagship missions, such as Europa Clipper, going to Europa, Juno, that's around Jupiter right now, JWST. All those missions are basically managed through NASA LSP. Now, specifically for you all, we actually serve as a technical advisor through the selection process, and we actually bundle your missions together. There's always a little bit of confusion between CSLI and Alana. We actually bundled a bunch of CubeSats together in CSLI and launch them. It becomes an Alana mission. So you'll see a mission like Alana 43 launched on X rocket, or Alana 50 just launched on X rocket. And Alana just stands for Educational Launch of Nanosatellites. Fun fact, the individual who actually ran CSLI before I was here, Alana was the name of his daughter. So he found out a cool way to actually work in the acronym into CSLI. And then some of this other stuff I've already touched on. We will provide you an ODAR, an orbital debris assessment report for compliance, to do that for your mission. So you don't really have to worry about that. The bottom right there, you can see that all the launch vehicles we have launched CubeSats on, we pretty much will launch for food. We will launch on anything that says and swears that it can get you into orbit. Because like I said, we have a limited budget and we have to stretch that budget as much as possible. And here's where I will turn it over to Jesse to talk UNP manifesting.
Overall, UNP and CSLI, the first charts, the approach is very similar. The requirements are very similar. So overall, we work with you very similarly. There's just some of the minor details there that are different. And this is just kind of my one chart on how UNP differs on how we actually go about finding new launches versus CSLI. So in UNP, the teams apply, they get accepted and to a full UNP nanosatellite cycle, that is. And then you do your 2 years in phase A. At the end of that 2 years, we hold a down select review. And we select probably 2 to 4 of the 10 that were in phase A to go on to phase B. Once the teams are in phase B, that's when we'll start looking for launches for them. And what we do on our side is we enter them into this process called the Space Experiments Review Board. At the DoD level, there's an entity called the Space Test Program, STP. You may have heard Norm mention that acronym earlier. STP is charged with purchasing and finding launches for experimental U.S. Department of Defense experiments. So they will buy their own launches. They will find launch slots on other vehicles like NASA or like SpaceX Transporter or whatever it may be. Just like CSLI has access to just about everything, STP also has access to just about everything. The way that they determine who gets to go on those is they hold these review boards. So it starts with us, in our case at least, at the Air Force Research Lab, CERB, where the teams will present to this board of reviewers, and all those experiments get ranked on priority. And now, most of these are not universities. These are government missions. They might be, multi-$100 million missions getting ranked. And so you might wonder, as a little university CubeSat sponsored by UNP that's just getting to participate in the process, how can you ever rank well? Well, the answer is UNP teams rank surprisingly well. This is one of the big reasons that we constantly work with you on the mission relevance and why we talk about why that matters. And it's also something that will help you practice for the CERB. The teams, at the lowest level CERB, the research lab CERB, we usually see maybe 20 to 30 experiments. And then at the Air Force level CERB, it's maybe like 50. And then at the DoD CERB, it's probably 60 or 70 experiments presenting. And UNP might be 5 or so of those. And usually the UNP schools come in around the middle, which is very, very good. Because again, they're beating out missions with $50 to $300 million behind them sometimes in the rankings. And the other thing though, is it doesn't actually matter if you don't rank super well, because again, since we're CubeSats, like Norm was mentioning earlier, you're all secondaries. There's almost always capacity on these rockets. Those big missions that are large satellites that need their own rocket, they need to rank really highly to have the justification to get an entire rocket bought for them. You as CubeSats, you'll fit on just about anything. So as long as you're in the process, you're going to get a ride. And especially if you're ranking well, like the UNP teams do. So once they're in that process, there's additional kind of documentation and other things provided that give more of the details about your requirements and your orbit needs and other things. An STP will go out and they will find launch slots that work for you on your timeline. Just like Norm was saying, keep the timelines realistic and all those things, because it's much more frustrating if you're being optimistic and then we have to decline or push back to different missions. Once they find those slots, once we think those slots are going to work out for you, we'll sign all the paperwork to commit you to those launches, and the rest of this process that Norm went through will start. So overall, pretty similar. The main difference is you're kind of moving, outside of UNP directly into this STP process, but we are helping you and guiding you and supporting you all through it and doing a lot of the interactions with them for you, because we work with STP all the time. And then, UNP will not actually commit to those launches until the teams pass the pre-integration review. And that's because we want to make sure that you have a mostly functioning satellite. We want to have a lot of confidence you'll get there before we commit to that launch. The other teams that are not selected can reapply to a new UNP cycle. So they would re-enter phase A rather than phase B. UNP does not allow anyone to direct go into the phase B. You have to participate in a phase A and then get selected for phase B. And usually that works out great for those teams. And it's totally open. We don't give any priority to those teams that want to then that reapply to be in the cycle. But at that point, since they've put in a couple of years of development on their satellite, they can usually write a very strong proposal. So they will apply. If they get selected, they can go again. They'll get another funding for 2 years. And especially teams that are new to this, that haven't developed satellites before, it's pretty hard to get nearly complete satellite in 2 years with the phase A funding. It's not uncommon, and it's not, a bad thing to take an extra couple of years and more thoroughly develop the satellite before getting into phase B. Well, thank you, everyone.